Hello and welcome. My name is Carl Schumacher, and I've been going to Good Shepherd Community Church since 1989. I've been a global outreach staff since then, and we were in East Asia for 25 years. We've been back now for a bit. I continue to work overseas. I work in the area of theological development, and what I want to do as I attend the men's time is I want to just make sure that we all have any supplemental materials that we might be able to use to help us as we get together in our groups to discuss. And so these videos are intended just to help you to have something in addition to look at before you actually get together for your group discussions. Also, I'll try to connect some of the dots. I think for me, always connecting dots and trying to understand how things relate helps me to understand. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you. So the very first thing we're going to look at is the cultural background. And it's essential to understand a cultural background of a book so that you can understand why Paul wrote what he wrote, because he's writing to a real church, to real people who have a real culture. And when we understand some of those cultural elements, we can see why Paul wrote the things that he did. So let me share I'm going to put a PowerPoint up here. And as we do that, we will just look at the Ephesian historical background. And if we were to think of the big idea would be how Christians can navigate cultures hostile to Christ. How Christians can navigate cultures hostile to Christ. And when you think about it, we actually are in a very similar situation, right? We live in Oregon, a very liberal state, and it may not be openly hostile to Christians like they were in the book of Ephesus, but there are many overlaps. And so what we want to do right now is we're going to look at the cultural elements that they actually had to navigate in Ephesus, and then we're going to draw some parallels to the same things that we have to do. And so there are going to be four cultural elements they had to navigate. The first one is they had the pull and the demands of their culture, and their culture really focused in a place called the Agora. It would be the business center. It would be the center of commerce. It's where all the relationships were made. It's where all the major businesses were, whether you were a tradesperson or what we'd call a white-collar person, that life would be surrounded and take place in the Agora. And so you might be thinking, well, that's great. What's the problem with Christians? Well, the problem was to get into the Agora, you actually had to go through an entrance. And when you did, they had these incense burners, and you had to drop your incense into the incense burner as an act of worship to whoever the Caesar was. And so in this case, it would have been Domitian. And so that's the first thing that they were to get entrance in, is you actually had to then compromise your own personal belief and do that. And so we have to be careful that, in a sense, they had to enter, they had to play by the rules. And what we want to do is make sure that we're not compromising, and that there's company rules, or that the place that you work for is that they say, well, you can't talk about Christ, or you have to do certain things, and that it would cause you to go against your faith or your own conscience. And so there are the pulls of our own culture and their demands. And so this is going to help us, one, to learn how to navigate that, the book of Ephesians will. The second cultural element that they had to navigate was they lived in a sexually charged culture. In fact, their whole worship system was built around the goddess Diana, or in this case, we call her Artemis. And she was a fertility god, and you would worship her, and as a result, you would be fruitful in whatever your endeavors. And what that required, though, is that you had priests, and these priests then had temple prostitutes, and we have the actual temple, you can see that on your screen, is 150 yards long, wider than a football field, and devoted to the worship of Artemis. And so the priests would gather temple prostitutes, it'd be men and women, and the worship service would culminate in an orgy, a sexual orgy. So it was a very sexually charged thing. Well, needless to say, Christians then couldn't enter into that, because that was certainly against how God had designed them and his desires. And again, here's the connection to us. We live in a very sexually charged culture also. Whether it's just looking at advertising and it's using sex to convey their message, or if it's pornography, whether it's sexual immorality, people living together before they get married, promiscuity, there's just all sorts of forms, and we have to, as Christians, we have to learn how to navigate that within our culture. The third cultural element that they had to navigate was just the power of politics and political figures. And you can see this is one temple, what we said is the temple to Artemis, but they also had temples to whoever the current Caesar was. And the current Caesar's name was Domitian. And Domitian was very much like Nero. And so he hated Christians, he persecuted Christians, and he wanted the Christians to give him full allegiance, meaning that they would bow down and worship to him. Needless to say, they couldn't do that and they wouldn't do that. But there's this temptation to allow politics to become our God in our own culture. And so we have to be careful, especially as we're moving into election season, that we want to be politically active, but we can't allow politics to be our God. And that is a very important point, that is that when we are with people, do we want to spend our energy on talking about politics or introducing people to Christ? And I would say we need to focus on the latter, because the former actually will burn bridges that you may want to actually build. And then finally, we come to the fourth cultural element they had to navigate, and that's in the area of demonic systems that were in place. And it's very easy to see when you're, with the temple to Artemis and, the sexual orgies that took place. But behind that, there's a demonic systems. Ephesians 2 talks about that. Ephesians 6 talks about that. And so we want to recognize that it's these demonic influences that were empowering and motivating people to move in the direction they did. And within our own culture, we have those same kind of demonic forces at play, and that the ruler of this world, we're told, is Satan, and that our battle is not flesh and blood, but it's the spiritual forces of darkness, Ephesians 6. And so we need to recognize that when we see somebody that we disagree with, whether it's morally, LGBTQ, homosexuality, if it's politically, regardless, whatever side of the divide you might be on politically, whether it's just whatever it happens to be, that person is not our enemy. That person has been captured by the enemy, and it's our job, our role as Christians to then move into those relationships and to build relationships and then to introduce Christ. And so just as the Ephesians had to navigate these kind of cultural elements to be effective communicators of the gospel and to live out the gospel in their culture, we have to do the same. So hopefully this has been helpful. And as we go through this, we'll continue to walk through the book of Ephesians, and these videos will help you to do that. So thank you for being with me at this one, and hopefully these will be helpful as we go on. Thanks.